Hey, Slater Crusaders, America's the greatest country in the world. Thanks for being here. Excited for our show. We have Larry Reed is going to be here from the Foundation for Economic Education. He has a new book called Jesus is a Socialist. It's a wonderful, quick, very important read. We'll do that in a little bit. First, I want to start here. I'm reading, I picked up Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. I just picked it up the other day. I read it, I was going to say I read it 2 years ago. That's a lie. I listened to it 2 years ago. Some books you can listen to, and it's fine. Some books you have to read. I think this is actually one you should read. So anyway, I walk by it every day, so I was like, I'm going to pick it up and see what happens. So I open it up, rule number 6, set your house in perfect order before you criticize the world. So in this chapter, he starts off with the extreme examples, right? School shooters, mass murderers, people who feel so angry, so bitter to the world that they take the ultimate judgment of humanity in their hands and they kill people. All right, so he starts off in the extreme. We shouldn't be surprised by this, by the way, when this happens. The first 2 sons of Adam and Eve, Cain, murdered Abel. Right? Not just murder someone who was innocent, but the murder of someone who was good. So the first 2 people after Adam and Eve, one murdered the other. So it's not a great start for humanity. Bottom line here is, though, there are people who really think that we can bring utopia on earth. They really think we can bring utopia, we can bring the garden back. We just need to create the right institutions. And part of that is kicking out the bad people, right? All the racist, bad people are in society. We got to kick them out so that our institutions can be perfect. And then we'll finally have this utopia that we all need and deserve. I want to play this clip of Jordan Peterson in just a second here, but he starts off talking about a client of his who was raised thinking that adults are angels, literally angels. And she was unbelievably naive about humanity and human nature. And then she was hurt by people. And Peterson says when you're that naive and you've been hurt, then you often disintegrate. That's what we say, you often disintegrate. Your whole world's been blown up by the evil of humanity because you're not prepared for it. And she went to college, and Jordan Peterson's like, whoa, hold on. Didn't you read any history? Right? Didn't that disturb your whole adults are angels hypothesis? Reading history? And she's like, yeah, I read it, but I compartmentalized it. Right? The history I'm reading, like that was then, and that was them. As opposed to the proper reading of history is, that is this, that is now, and most importantly, they are me. When you read history, you can't be thinking, oh, this is about someone else. It's not about someone else. It's about you. And you can read history, and maybe sometimes, rarely, you can identify with the victims. But most of the time, you better be identifying with the perpetrators. Peterson says, unless you read history and identify with the perpetrators, then you don't understand history at all. It's uncomfortable, it's hard to do that. But it's the only proper reading of history. Let's pick it up there. Here's what he says.
Look, I've told him this for 30 years. Here's something you have to understand. If you were in Nazi Germany, the statistical probability is overwhelming that you would have been a perpetrator. Right? You think you would have rescued Anne Frank. It's like, think again. Those people are very, 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 very rare. They put their lives on the line to do that. They put their families' lives on the line to do that. You think you're one of those people? Really? It's like that. All that means is that you know nothing. You know nothing about yourself. You know nothing about people. You know nothing about politics or economics or history. It's a harsh lesson.
See yourself in the perpetrator, but when we read history, we're always the heroes, right? We'd all be abolitionists back in the day of slavery, all of us. Everyone who's woke today, if they were born in the South in the 1800s, all of them would be against slavery. This is, I found this tweet recently. This is a professor at Princeton, Robert George. He said, sometimes I ask students what their position on slavery would have been had they been white and living in the South before abolition. And guess what? They all would have been abolitionists. They all, isn't that amazing? That's just fantastic. Good for them. They all would have bravely spoken out against slavery and worked tirelessly against it. Of course, this is nonsense. Only the tiniest fraction of them, or of any of us, would have spoken up against slavery or lifted a finger to free the slaves, which we know is true because slavery's been around for thousands of years and no one lifted a finger to stop it until America. Most of them and us would have gone along. Many would have supported the slave system and happily benefited from it. But I guarantee you all these writers say they all think that they would have been abolitionists. It reminded me of this Bill Maher clip from this weekend talking about cancel culture. Here's what he said.
Also makes me always want to go, who are these perfect people out there in the world today who have never made any mistake of any kind? And don't they think it's going to come back and bite them in the ass?
No. They don't. Because they all think they're abolitionists. They all think they're perfect. So I see a couple ways you can handle this. I see three, actually. I see three ways. You can be like Jordan Peterson's first client. You can naively go through life thinking you're a wonderful person, all the while canceling people and treating people terribly. Right? So you think you're a good person, but you're actually a bad person. Or you can know you're a bad person and be a bad person, right? Be like those murderers that he starts the chapter out with. Okay, so I want to be clear. So you can think you're good and be bad. You can think you're bad and be bad. Or you can know you're a bad person and then be a good person. And you think, what about the fourth option? I don't think there's a fourth option. The fourth option would be you know you're a good person and then you actually are a good person. But I don't think it's a thing because I think you need the humility to know your ability for evil before you can really work on being good. So you have to know how bad you are or bad you can be before you can then be good. So otherwise you think you're way closer to that first option of thinking you're good, but being way worse than you probably realize. Now, it's always on a curve, right? You're always better than that guy over there. But objectively speaking, you don't want to be that first person thinking you're good, but you're not. Way better to think you're bad and then actively work on being good. Now, all these rioters, right, they probably think they're good people. The First shared yesterday a video of some like Trump supporters on the corner, and there's like one or two like Antifa guys all decked out in black, whatever, just screaming at the Trump supporters, blank, 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 just like everything you possibly had. That person probably thinks he's a good person, right? They probably think they're on the right side of history. And when they read history, they probably identify with the victims. They don't even see how they're the perpetrators. Today, they're the perpetrators. But it's not hopeless, and here's the point. Peterson, in his book, he talks about another client of his. Her mom died when she was young, was raised by her grandmother, who was a terrible person. Her dad was an addict, just really, really bad life. And here's what Peterson said. My client had a son. She perpetuated none of this with him. He grew up truthful and independent and hardworking and smart. And instead of widening the tear in the cultural fabric that she inherited and transmitting it, she sewed it up. Such things can be done. And the point is that the evil in the world, and Nietzsche spoke to this a lot, the evil in the world, and I think this is a life-changing point, by the way. But when you're the victim of evil in the world, you can either perpetuate it or end it. And Nietzsche's point was, you can learn good by experiencing evil. So if you were bullied as a kid, you can learn to either bully and pass that on and keep doing it, or you can know how terrible it is and stop. Someone who is tormented by their parents can either then torment their kids or learn how awful it was to be tormented and stop. Most people don't think that they have the power to stop. You can stop. Peterson makes the point that I'd argue nearly all of the people who sexually abuse kids were themselves sexually abused as kids. But it's also true that most people who were sexually abused as kids don't go on and sexually abuse kids. Mathematically, that has to be true. So most people who are sexually abused stop. So you think of all the trauma and all the evil and all the bad things that have happened to you in your life, and you think you have to pass it on. No, you stop. But how? And Peterson says you start small. And he asks simple questions. Have you taken full advantage of the opportunities offered to you? Are you right now? Are you working on your career? Or are you letting bitterness and resentment hold you back and drag you down? Have you cleaned up your life? And if the answer is no, something to try. He says, how does he put it? He says, start to stop doing what you know to be wrong. That's it. Start to stop doing what you know to be wrong. Start stopping today. Don't blame capitalism. Don't blame this or that. Don't blame the radical end. Don't blame your enemies. Don't blame the system. Don't blame the legacy of slavery. Don't blame white supremacy. Don't blame anything. Focus on yourself now. Don't reorganize the state until you've ordered your own experience. Have some humility. If you can't bring peace to your own household, how dare you try to rule a city? And I think that's what we see today. I think that's all this is. We have people who don't have peace in their household and don't want to confront that chaos in their household. So instead, just project it onto the whole world and try to rule the city instead, thinking that'll bring them peace or happiness. This is Chad Felix Green. He said, the left has demonized every provable method of succeeding in America. They've demonized it as white supremacy. So all these ways that Jordan Peterson would talk about how to improve your life, how to order your life, they're bad. They're white supremacist things. Individualism, like focus on yourself, education, self-reliance, family, self-control, right? Every single one of those things has been demonized. You've seen it all, like the Smithsonian and all these other, our friend Chris Rufo has done a great job highlighting all these diversity, inclusion, equity seminars going on in different levels of government and different businesses. And all of these white supremacist things are the things, the tools you need, we all need to improve our own personal lives. Remember those concentric circles we talked about a couple weeks ago? To improve our life in the middle so that we can work outward life, our individual life, our family, our community, our country, the human species. But you gotta start inside, but every single one of those things are deemed as white supremacists. Even showing up on time for the love of Pete is deemed a white supremacist thing. So instead, people aren't improving their life and they're just bitter and angry. And bitter people like to tear down other people, like to bring other people down with them. How much of what we see today is our broken culture and a broken culture, broken society, broken politics? How much of it is just hurt people not dealing with their own personal issues and projecting it out into the world? We should each of us, stop doing that. I want to give two examples next. I got a real life example of someone stopping, and then someone who started stopping, and then I'll give a fake example, a made up example next. Do it next. True story. Mike Slater. Spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. We're going to talk with Professor Vincent Racaniello coming up at the end of the show. I want to ask him about some studies that have come out, and obviously conflicting studies, right, of how transmissive kids are with COVID. So we'll talk about that coming up in just a few minutes. First, I want to drive this point home here about turning others evil, transforming evil into good for you and for the world. So I think I was going to say the best example of this, but I don't want to say the best because every person who overcomes trauma and conquers it and breaks that cycle is doing something truly heroic. So I'm not in the business like ranking these. But let me share, let's do the mythological one first. Let's do Hercules. So the quick story of Hercules. When I think Hercules, first thing I think of is, what was the movie? Hercules. You know what I mean? Was that Eddie Murphy? Whatever. That's the first thing I think of. And then the other is the Disney movie, right? That's pathetic that those are my first two. Dr. Dolittle. Is that it? No. Nutty Professor. Thank you very much. So here's the story of Hercules. Myths are important, by the way. Myths define a culture. America has myths too, and they're important, not bad, they're good. So the 12 labors of Hercules. So he was told by the king to do these impossible tasks, and he did them all. Killed the lion, killed the 9-headed Hydra snake. Guys, can you throw that picture back up? I think this is him killing the dog that guards it's like multi-headed dog that's guarding Hades or whatever. That statue, the guy who did that used my abs as the model, which is not, I didn't get any money for that, which is unbelievable, but that is a pretty close representation there, which is very impressive. My favorite task of his was the one that was intended to be humiliating. So it was difficult, yeah, but it was a humiliating task. So he had to clean out the king's stables. The king had like 1,000 cattle, and Hercules, one of the tasks was to clean out the stable in a day, right? He just wanted to be humiliated by covered in filth. So what Hercules did is he redirected this giant river and flushed out the entire stables there. Anyway, 12 labors of Hercules. Why did he do these things? Why did he do them? So I would have assumed, I've always assumed, he was just super strong and did like impossible things for fun, just because he could. Or he liked the challenge, or he was looking for fame, right? Wanted the accolades, wanted to live with the gods for eternity, wanted to be seen as a god. Just a big show off, right? Did it for the ladies, right? With all these like vain reasons. It's not why he did these. He did it because he wanted to be punished for a terrible thing that he did. He was trying to make amends. So the short of this is Zeus was married to Hera, but Hercules was born of another woman. So Hera was super jealous and vengeful and terrible. So she tried to kill Hercules a couple times. And then when he was older, she cast a spell on him, making him go crazy. And in his madness, Hercules killed his wife and 2 children. And his madness wore off, and he was wrecked with grief and guilt. So he went to Apollo, and he begged to be punished for what he'd done. It was an act of penance. He wanted to repent for what he did. And to do so, to repent, he had to confront these impossible labors, which we can say are our own sins in our own life. These impossible, seemingly impossible labors, right? The cleaning out of our own stables in our life. Now, in Christianity, only Jesus can do this. But even going to Jesus, sort of like Hercules going to Apollo and the Oracle of Delphi, even that takes incredible courage and humility, right? So go back to our first segment, the humility part is, maybe I'm not that good, right? Remember the first option was I'm good, I think I'm good, but you're actually not, actually bad, right? You're prideful. It takes a ton of humility to be like, you know what, when I read history, I'm the perpetrator. I wouldn't have been an abolitionist. I wouldn't have rescued Anne Frank. I'm actually not that good. That takes incredible humility, and it takes courage to go and fix it. The one time I did get to talk to Jordan Peterson, I asked him what the biggest characteristic we're missing today, or what we need more of, and he said courage. And I would add humility to that as well. Those are 2 things in very short supply. Anyway, Hercules wasn't looking to take over the world. He wasn't looking for fame. He wasn't looking to rule over other people. He wasn't looking to become a king. He was trying to get his own house in order. So the question is, what Herculean task do you need to do today and every day? And what a triumph to even think about it and confront it and then to do it. Goodness. All right, so that's the mythological example. The real example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a soldier on the front lines against the Nazis. So he's a Soviet on the front lines against the Nazis. After that, he was thrown in a Soviet prison labor camp where then he got cancer. Okay, so this guy has every reason to be resentful and bitter at everything and everyone, right? Short life, one life, this is the one I got. He has way more reasons to be bitter than we do, than most people today. Certainly, try telling your problems to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Listen, I don't want to go on a whole side right here because we got 2 great guests. But let me do real quick. Have you been following this Ellen DeGeneres controversy? Like, I know it doesn't matter at all, right? But she may end her show and whatever. You know, one of the complaints from her former staffers, right? You've been following this. So it seems like these complaints from her staffers, to me, it seems like a lot of entitled millennials who grew up dreaming of working at an office like Google's with slides and ball pits and beanbag chairs and show up whenever you want and free food and all that stuff. And these millennial workers, they showed up to play at this super fun show that they love and Ellen's so funny, blah, blah, and they got this rude awakening that this is a job and a business. And they're like, oh, my bosses are mean. One of the complaints is some of the staff they were asking each other what their spirit animal was, just like a joke. And someone said, oh, that's offensive. And then they called her the PC police. And that was one of her complaints for a racist, toxic work environment. It's like, give me a break. Go whine to Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And the same thing, we share on the show so many stories of former slaves who were not bitter to their master about being a slave. But we're supposed to be bitter today about the legacy of slavery 150 plus years ago? Give me a break. Anyway, here's Peterson. Okay, so back to Solzhenitsyn. During his many trials, Solzhenitsyn encountered people who comported themselves nobly under horrific circumstances. Right? He's looking at these people, he's like, how are you keeping it together? He contemplated their behavior deeply. Then he asked himself the most difficult question. Had he personally contributed to the catastrophe of his life? And if so, how? There's the humility and the courage. So he thought about all the sins he's committed in this labor camp. He thought about how many times he's done things that he knew he shouldn't have done. How many times he betrayed himself and lied. How often do we ask those questions today? Never. Never ask. It's always someone else's fault, never mine. I'm always the victim. And then maybe people in the past would have blamed like a mean God or something. Maybe that was like the last 10 years. But now people blame the mean system, right? The racist system, the sexist system, whatever. It doesn't matter. It's all just deflection and finger pointing and excuse making, not to deal with your own stuff. But Solzhenitsyn took his life apart and then rebuilt it anew. And then he wrote the Gulag Archipelago, which was released outside the Soviet Union, and it destroyed the credibility of communism that everyone was pretending to ignore. And now I guess we're pretending to ignore it all over again. One man's decision to change his life, instead of cursing fate, or today would be cursing the system, cursing sexism, racism. One man's decision to change his life shook the whole pathological system of communist tyranny to its core. In other words, he got his own house in order, then changed the world. So I ask it again, how much of everything we're seeing right now is just the result of generations of people not wanting to deal with their own lives and instead blame everyone else and now everything else? And if that's true, and I think it is, how much credibility should we be giving to their institutional changes that they propose, when really, and I don't mean this demeaningly, like everyone should do this, really these people just need to go see a therapist and get their own life in order before they go out reordering the world. Coming up, Larry Reed, his new book called Was Jesus a Socialist? No is the answer, but we'll talk with him next. True story, Mike Slater. By the way. Hey, Slater Crusaders, you should buy this book right here. Was Jesus a socialist? No is the answer. Look, it's short, it's quick, it's concise. I know you've heard these arguments before, and I think we need to be properly armed to rebuke them. Was Jesus a socialist? Why this question's being asked again, and why the answer is almost always wrong. Larry Reed is the president emeritus of the FEE, Foundation for Economic Education. Larry, great to talk to you, brother.
Hey, thank you, Mike. Appreciate your having me.
Yes, excellent book, and really everyone needs to buy it. So it's interesting. We've talked on the show a lot lately about how the church, this is our special last week, about how the church has been using tools of the world and of Marxism and the women's and gender studies classroom inside the church and how the problems with that. But it's funny because you also sometimes see the world using the Bible, using the words of Jesus against us, right? And it's like, hold on, wait a second. You're using that wrong. So first of all, why do they do that? Why is that a tactic of theirs?
Well, I think the left in particular knows that if they can grab on to someone as well known and loved as Jesus Christ and claim him as one of theirs, they'll score some points. They'll bring along some people who don't know the New Testament to a considerable degree and may be gullible for that line of reasoning. But there's nothing in what Jesus taught that is sympathetic to the ethics or the principles of socialism.
Give us, I know you go through 3 of the parables here. Give us one of them here that people often use to give credibility to socialism. Okay,
I think the parable of the talents is one of the terrific ones, because you can't imagine a socialist ever saying anything like what Jesus has the man who owns an estate in this parable says. But this man is leaving his estate for a time, and he entrusts a portion of it, a different portion, for each of 3 men. And he tells them, when I come back, I'll see what you've done with it. And so later he returns, he calls the 3 men together, and he says to the first person, oh, by the way, I think I labeled this the parable of the talents. I meant the parable of the workers in the vineyard.
Sorry.
Oh, wait a minute. I'm sorry. Oh, is this
No,
live,
you're on
Mike?
talents. Yeah.
Okay.
But
Okay,
yeah, no, you're okay. You're doing
Sorry.
good. I know what you're saying. Talents. You're telling the talent story.
Yeah, I've done this so many times. I'm sorry, I got messed up. So he calls the 3 men together, and he says to the first guy, well, what did you do with what I entrusted you with? And the first man says, well, you'll be happy with me. I preserved it. I buried it in the backyard. I have no more than what I had when you left. And Jesus criticizes him. He says, what? Basically, you didn't magnify the wealth in any way. And then the second man, he asks him, what did you do with it? And he said, oh, I doubled or tripled the wealth that you entrusted me with. He's praised. The third guy magnifies it even more. He says, I've got 10 times what you entrusted me with. He's the one that Jesus reserves the greatest praise for. And in fact, he says, I'll take the money from the first guy and give it to the third guy because he knows how to magnify wealth. Well, no socialist would ever say anything like that. That wouldn't be a socialist lesson. That's a lesson in private property and magnification of wealth through the capitalist process.
I love that you share also the story of the Good Samaritan, which we're all familiar with, but the man who helps he never like robs the next guy to pay for this man who's hurt or injured, right? He always does it himself. And I think that's the key point of all of it, right?
Oh, absolutely. Jesus was interested in what's in your heart, not how you vote or what you assign some responsibility to somebody else for. So the Samaritan in that famous parable is a good one because of his own free will and with his own resources. He chose to help the man in need. It didn't call upon some politician or bureaucracy to intervene.
Yeah, I think last time we were talking, Larry, you got me thinking, like, what if there really was a socialist Jesus, right? Like straight up, like full-on socialist Jesus. It would be a totally different story, right? The parables would be completely different in every way. It would be like you need to go to Caesar and raise taxes and then get more money and right, like none of that nonsense.
That's right. Or if you remember the story of the multitude, the loaves and the fishes. 5,000 people showed up to hear Jesus speak, and they're very hungry. And the disciples say, where are we going to get the food to feed these people? And Jesus does not say to them, well, let's find a rich neighborhood or maybe a bank and let's go rob it and we'll bring the loot here and redistribute it. No, he uses his own unique power to magnify wealth. He doesn't pilfer a crumb from anybody else.
You mentioned that Jesus is after the heart. I think the root of all of this is envy.
Yes.
You speak to that for a minute. And it's amazing, I forget if it was Soul or Milton who talked about how it's always the other person. It was Milton Friedman. The other person's being greedy. You're never greedy, right? Yeah. And you're greedy for wanting to keep your money, but the politician's never greedy for wanting to take your money. For some reason, he's the noble one. How is that?
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Envy is evil, and it is so condemned multiple times in both the Old and New Testament. A person who is envious it tends to count the other guy's blessings instead of his own. He stops looking inwardly for ways to improve himself. He gets involved in dragging another person down instead of pulling himself up. It never ends well. Envy, in fact, results in divvying up a shrinking pie, the economy, instead of baking a bigger one for everybody. And throughout history, when civilizations descend into mass envy, then you end up with things like confiscation of wealth, the attack on the productive, and there's less for everybody.
Yeah, I really think envy is the root of really all this. I'm reminded of C.K. Lewis. He has a great scene in one of his TV shows where he's telling his daughter, like, life's not fair. And he says the only reason to look into somebody else's bowl is to make sure that they have enough. The little girl wanted like more food than her brother. They didn't have the same amount, and it's not fair. It's like, no, the only reason to look into somebody else's bowl is to make sure they have enough. That's such a good line. Larry, I know everyone's used the line before, render unto Caesar. What's the proper way to look at that? And not higher taxes.
That's right. Socialists like to say that, because Jesus said, if it's Caesar's, give it to him, then therefore he must be in favor of not only taxation, but ever higher taxation. Whatever Caesar says is his, which is absurd. Can you imagine Jesus ever endorsing whatever a dictator wants to take from anybody, and no matter what he wants to use the money for? That's ridiculous and out of context totally. This was a very clever response on the part of Jesus to the Pharisees, who were trying to trick him into saying something that sounded like tax evasion. And then they could run to the Roman authorities and have him arrested. So they show him this coin with the image of Emperor Augustus on it. And Jesus says, well, if it's Caesar's, give it to him. But he doesn't say that it is. He doesn't say that anything is Caesar's. He leaves that question to us. That's an earthly political matter for us to resolve. He does not say, this is how much government should take and what it should use the money for. So socialists completely misread that. In effect, Jesus has pulled the wool over their eyes too, as well as the Pharisees.
So good. I love the last chapter. You bring in C.S. Lewis and this other theologian who I'm not familiar with, and I hate that I'm not. Why did you decide to talk about these two guys, and what did they say?
Well, I'm an economist and historian who happens to be a Christian, and I thought that perhaps for the integrity of the book, it would be important to do more than just share my views, but rather to call upon a couple of very eminent theologians who I have great respect for. And they're well known, and certainly the first one, C.S. Lewis, who was born in Britain, died in 1963, wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, Mere Christianity, and so many other books. He was a great defender of human liberty, though his attention was focused overwhelmingly on theological matters. When he looked at things like earthly government, he made it plain that human beings are flawed from the get-go, and the last thing you'd ever want to do is to entrust humans with earthly police and political power that could do great harm to other people. So he was anti-socialist, pro-individualist, and against the concentration of power for socialistic purposes.
And the other guy?
The other guy, J. Gresham Machen, was an American. He taught at Princeton in the 19-teens and 1920s, constantly doing battle with theological liberals who he thought were not reading the Bible properly or carefully. And so finally he left Princeton, started his own famous theological seminary, still in operation to this day, Westminster Seminary in Philadelphia. He testified in Congress in the 1920s when the proposal to create a federal Department of Education came forward. And that testimony is a gem to read. All these almost 100 years later, he pointed out that when government begins to control education, it will control young minds, and it will not teach them either liberty or character. And of course, it took a while to get a federal Department of Education, but all of his prophecies came true. Today, government education is, I think, doing great harm to the character of the American people.
Of course, which is why fee is so important, the foundation for economic education, real education. Buy this book, everyone. I'm serious. It's very, very good. It's quick, it's short. Why Jesus Was a Socialist by Larry Reed, fee.org. Larry, always good to talk to you, brother. Appreciate you.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mike.
And have a wonderful day. We got Professor Rack and Yellow coming up next. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders. Every Monday, but it's Tuesday because we were off yesterday and I screwed it all up. Whatever. It feels like a Monday now because we're talking with Professor Vincent Racaniello. He is the professor of virology at Columbia University, and you have to listen to his podcast. It's like obviously by far the best podcast related to COVID. It's microbe.tv, and the podcast is called This Week in Virology. Professor, how are you, sir?
I got another virus for you today. Look at that.
Oh, geez.
You know what that is?
Another. Oh, I thought we had like another actual like virus we had to be worried about, not model of virus. That is that's a SARS-CoV-2, Professor. Come on.
You bet. There you go.
You bet.
What gave it away? What gave it away?
The corona spikes.
There you go. Good. Yeah, it's a 3D printed model. I think it's beautiful, don't you? It glows in the dark, too.
That's funny. Let's chat, Professor, about the kiddos, because I think it's the big thing. First of all, let's be super grateful. I am every day that kids aren't getting sick and dying, right? That this doesn't like affect kids the most. I just want to take a second and think about how things would be totally different, our calculus would be. But I know in your podcast you talked about a study done of all different ages to measure the amount of shedding done. Can you walk us through that study?
So when you are infected, right, the virus goes in your nose or upper tract. It reproduces in your upper respiratory tract, and then it can move down into your lungs. But as it's reproducing here, you're shedding it in your breath and secretions. And so in this study, they take a swab and they rub your mucosal surface, and then they look for viral RNA by PCR in the laboratory. And you can measure how much viral RNA is coming out. It's kind of a surrogate for virus, right? Because it's very hard to measure virus. You need a special lab to do that. So instead, we use viral RNA as a surrogate. And they compared people of different ages and asked who is shedding and how much. And the kids...
I would say it's interesting that there'd even be a difference, I guess, in my non-scientific brain. So was there a difference, first of all?
Yeah, the very young kids seem to shed. So shedding means, they can swab it. So presumably it's coming out to be transmitted to other people. The youngest kids, I think less than 5 years old, shed more than the 10 to 19-year-olds and adults. I mean, I think the numbers are very close. But the point is, even if they're all even, the point is that kids are shedding and kids can transmit because some people have been saying they don't transmit, and that's just not right. There's plenty of growing evidence now that they do transmit. So listening to your podcast talk about this, it was, I hear that, and then I can easily make a headline about it, which is probably not. It certainly doesn't tell the whole story. But you guys talked about, well, are these symptomatic people or asymptomatic people? So that's a variable. Yeah. And then there's a variable, well, are these kids in school or out of school? Because you talked about some Korea study. Are they in school or are they out of school? Are they doing, like, what activities are they doing that maybe we shed differently? There's so many variables. How do we account for that in life? Those are all great points. I mean, the Korea study that we talked about, the kids were not in school, right? So, and there they looked at transmission patterns. They identified some index case that was positive, and then they say, who do they transmit to? And, the index cases could be kids transmitting to others. But as they say, the kids weren't in school, so maybe it would change. Because in school, kids are interacting differently, right? They're playing with each other, they're close. And so you could imagine that the transmission would even be greater. But you said something that's really interesting. Why would you expect different ages to influence shedding? Well, younger kids would have not as well developed an immune system, and so you can imagine that they might shed more. But the point really is that they are shedding, and therefore they're going to transmit virus.
Yep. There's so many kid studies I've seen. I don't know if you came across this one. This is an overnight camp in Georgia. Have you seen this by any chance?
Yeah.
You did? Yeah. See, what am I talking? Like, why would I even question it? You know what I mean? Just so everyone knows clearly. Yeah, well, of course we will, but I'm saying, like, why would I be like, Professor, have you seen this? Of course you've seen this study. Just so everyone knows, there's no, like, pre-conversation between me and the professor. Yeah. I don't give him, like, a heads up when we talk about. My goal is actually to try to throw curveballs at him and throw him off, but he can't be. So what do we take away from this camp in Georgia?
I have to say, Mike, I do like that. I don't get questions from you ahead of time because I want to stay on my toes, right, and be able to field anything. Right. And so the camp in Georgia, again, kids are transmitting, bottom line. The camp has got young kids. It's not a school setting, but it's a kind of, and the kids are singing and shouting and do whatever you do in camp, and that's a great way to transmit. Even though they're outside, obviously they're indoor activities, but it just reinforces the transmission among kids. So when kids, and in fact, Mike, the really key thing that I read is that there was a school somewhere where the kids went back, and on the first day they found a positive kid and they had to shut down, right? So this emphasizes that unless you test extensively, you're going to have problems opening up schools.
Yeah, which goes back to our dollar testing that we talked about last week. So, okay, so affirm is so obvious. This thing spreads very simply, easily, and it happens. The next step would be maybe like ICU care and then death. What are some numbers that you're looking at that maybe are hopeful and then maybe not so good when it comes to ICU and then death rates?
Well, according to my clinician, Daniel Griffin, he in the New York area, there's been an uptick in cases. It's still not very high, but they're rising because people come in from other parts of the country where there are lots of infections. And so his ICU numbers are going up, and people are still dying. I mean, he tells us about some patients who keep progressing to worse, and he can't help them. On the other hand, the modalities he's developed over the past few months can work in a lot of cases, and so he's more optimistic about being able to save lives. And I think, his information percolates to other parts of the country, and other doctors and other hospitals can do the same thing. So I think the death situation isn't as dire as it was before, but it doesn't say that people are not going to die. People still will die, especially over 65.
Yep. That's your age that you're focusing on now, 65?
65 and up,
65
which includes me.
Yeah. Tell me about this Roche trial that did not go well.
So the Roche trial was a therapy, which is an antibody, a monoclonal antibody, directed against a protein in us that is the binding site for a molecule called IL-6. IL-6 is produced during immune responses to viruses, and it's one of those molecules that makes you feel sick. Okay, and so one of the ideas is if you block the molecule from attaching to its receptor on the cell, then the serious outcomes of SARS-CoV-2 infection could be ameliorated or blocked, right? So the Roche trial found no benefit in terms of, reduced hospital stay or improved prognosis when they used this. And that was also found in a couple of other studies. But Daniel Griffin is more positive because he says if you're going to use this drug, this antibody against IL-6 receptor, you also have to use an immunosuppressant, like a steroid, because if IL-6 doesn't have anywhere to bind, its levels shoot way up, and that can make the patient sick. So he thinks that trials where they combine, steroids with anti-IL-6 receptor antibodies are going to show some promise. So he's not willing to put that to bed yet.
Okay, we have 2 minutes. So I want to ask you one more time, if you can slow that down, exactly what this thing does. I want to be able to visualize it here.
So IL-6 is a protein you make when you're infected. It's part of your immune response, right? And it's necessary for mobilizing cells to get rid of the infection. But it can also have serious consequences. It can make you sick. So IL-6 can make you sick. So this antibody therapy was designed to get rid of that in people who get really sick from their immune response to infection. They figure, let's block the immune response or part of it.
But it doesn't affect the virus. It just affects this one thing that prevents. Okay, interesting.
Right, because remember, a lot of the serious cases are people's immune response is going crazy, right? And IL-6 is part of it.
Okay. Yeah, okay, that makes sense now. Yeah, I'm more of just in life, I'm more of like a get to the root kind of guy, but that may not always be good in science, right? Or in virology.
Well, with these very sick patients, by the time they're that sick and in the hospital in the ICU, they don't have a lot of virus. So it's really controlling their response.
Oh, interesting. Okay. What do you think about the Yale epidemiologist the other day who wrote this article in Newsweek about HCQ with some other things as well? Because again, this is such a political thing now. And that was his main point. He's never seen anything so political. But just as a virologist, what's your take on it?
Well, I think the key is the study we talked about, which shows if you take cells from the lungs of patients and you put them in the lab and you infect them and you add HCQ, no effect. It does not block. So there's no way that drug can have any therapeutic benefit because it doesn't block the virus in cells from the human lung. And maybe he's not aware of that, but there's no way that this can work. And that's the basic virology that was done to show that.
Oh, wow. Okay, let's talk more about that one next week. There's a lot there. We can do a whole 10 minutes on HCQ, I'm sure.
Okay.
30 seconds, Professor. Any parting thought? Any last thing you want to make sure we think about?
So, all these vaccines that are directed against this spike protein, right, here on the particle,
Yeah.
a lot of them are in trials. They're in phase 3. They're being tested for efficacy. And what they do is they measure antibodies against the spike. But what we have always said is maybe that's not what's important. Maybe it's our T cell response. And a few papers have come out that we'll discuss now this week that show that the T cell response is really important for resolving disease. And if we're not measuring that in these vaccine trials, we won't know it. So
I loved your thought last week that we got to attack this virus in different ways, not all eggs in one basket. I like that thought a lot. Microbe.tv, obviously go way more depth with the professor and his friends on his show This Week in Virology. Professor, always good to talk to you, sir. We'll do it next week.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Really good. It's always a wonderful mix of, he always makes me, or he doesn't. It makes me feel inadequate, stupid, and super smart and informed at the same time. It's wonderful. All right, that's it. That's our show. We'll do it again tomorrow. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.